They tried to banish my boat, so I blocked their entire marina and their future on HOA Letter 1 old sailboat. And a plan so arrogant it nearly turned my peaceful lakeside home into a real estate empire playground. But they made one mistake. They tried to erase my father's legacy. So I fenced off the only access point to their prized marina, the one they didn't know I legally owned. President's fundraiser collapsed, her husband's shady land grab exposed, and the whole neighborhood about to find out what happens when you push the wrong man too far. If you're watching this from Oregon, drop a comment below. I'd love to know how many of you have dealt with overzealous HOAs like mine. The day I received that first notice from the Homeowners Association was like any other at Lakeside Estates, peaceful, quiet, with the gentle lapping of Green Lake's waters against the shoreline behind my property. The morning sun had cast a golden glow across the lake, and I had been enjoying my coffee on the deck watching a pair of ospreys circle above the water, hunting for their breakfast. Looking back now, I should have recognized it as the calm before the storm. It's amazing how quickly things can change when someone with too much power decides you don't fit their vision. The stories I've heard since my own ordeal suggest these little fiefdoms of suburban power exist everywhere, quietly controlling the lives of homeowners who often don't realize how much authority they've signed away until it's too late. 3 years ago, after finalizing my divorce, I purchased this lakefront home as a fresh start. The end of my 15-year marriage had left me feeling unmoored, adrift in a life I no longer recognized. When I first saw this property, a modest 2-story craftsman with cedar siding and a wraparound porch, something inside me settled. It wasn't just the house that spoke to me, it was what lay beyond it. The property wasn't the largest in the neighborhood, but it had something special. Direct access to Green Lake and a small private dock where I could keep the Wanderer, my father's sailboat. Dad had taught me to sail on that boat when I was just 10 years old, his patient hands guiding mine on the tiller, his calm voice explaining how to read the wind and the ripples on the water. After he passed away 5 years ago from a sudden heart attack, the Wanderer became more than just a vessel. It was a connection to him, to memories I couldn't replace, to conversations we never finished. The 30-year-old sailboat wasn't particularly impressive by modern standards, but I kept it in excellent condition, often spending weekends maintaining its wooden trim and polishing its brass fittings until they gleamed in the sunlight. Lakeside Estates was everything I wanted in a neighborhood, a perfect blend of natural beauty and community. The development had been built in the late 1980s with 75 homes arranged in a horseshoe pattern around the picturesque lake. 25 of these homes, including mine, had the privilege of direct lake access with private docks. Most of my neighbors were friendly, particularly Bob Martinez, a retired military man who lived 2 doors down. Bob was in his mid-60s with salt and pepper hair, always trimmed to military precision, but his demeanor was anything but rigid. He had a way of cutting through nonsense with good humor that immediately put people at ease. Then there was Grace Whitmore, a real estate attorney who had the property adjacent to mine. In her late 30s, Grace had an energetic presence and sharp mind that made her both an excellent neighbor and a formidable ally. We often gathered at the community marina for weekend barbecues or occasional sailing outings. The marina itself was a point of pride for the community, a U-shaped dock with slips for 12 boats, a spacious deck with built-in seating, and a pavilion where residents socialized throughout the year. It was accessible via a narrow strip of land that curved around from the main community path, a seemingly insignificant detail that, as I would later discover, had significant importance to my story. Everything changed 6 months ago when Anna Sinclair was elected as the new HOA president. I hadn't paid much attention to the election. I worked remotely as a marine engineering consultant and often kept to myself. The previous president, an elderly gentleman named Walter, had been reasonable and hands-off. Anna, however, had campaigned on a platform of elevating property values through aesthetic excellence and modernizing community standards. At the time, those phrases seemed harmless enough. That morning in April, I found the HOA notice tucked into my mailbox. The letter, printed on thick cream-colored paper with the Lakeside Estates logo embossed at the top, stated in no uncertain terms that my boat was in violation of community guidelines regarding aesthetic standards for watercraft. I was ordered to remove the Wanderer from my dock within 30 days or face a fine of $100 per day. What confused me most was that there had never been any previous mention of aesthetic standards for boats. The Wanderer was well-maintained, structurally sound, and while not brand new, certainly not an eyesore. I walked down the stone path that wound from my back porch to the dock, pine needles crunching softly beneath my feet. Standing at the edge of the weathered wooden planks, I looked at my father's boat with fresh eyes, trying to see what might have triggered this notice. The Wanderer was a 26-foot Pearson sloop with classic lines and a deep blue hull that contrasted beautifully with the honey-colored teak of her trim. Dad had bought her secondhand in 1992 and lovingly restored her over several years. I had continued his tradition of maintenance, and despite her age, she was in excellent condition. Nothing seemed to miss that could possibly violate even the strictest interpretation of aesthetic standards. Then I glanced at the neighboring docks, scanning the various vessels moored along our shoreline. 3 houses down, a speedboat with peeling paint and a blue tarp haphazardly covering a damaged section sat undisturbed. 5 houses in the other direction, a pontoon boat that hadn't moved in at least a year rested against its moorings, its faded aluminum showing signs of neglect. Neither of those vessels had received citations, as I would later confirm with their owners. The hypocrisy was glaring. It became clear that the Wanderer alone had been singled out, and I was determined to find out why. After making a few calls to neighbors, a pattern emerged. Anna Sinclair seemed to be targeting certain residents with selective enforcement of rules, some of which didn't even exist in our community bylaws. What I didn't understand was why she had set her sights on me. I had never had any interaction with Anna beyond a casual hello at community events. As I prepared to attend the monthly HOA meeting scheduled for that evening, I couldn't have known that my father's old sailboat would become the catalyst for a neighborhood power struggle unlike anything Lakeside Estates had ever seen. I didn't know then that the vintage boat would be the first stone cast in a battle that none of us could have anticipated. But by the time it was over, everyone in Lakeside Estates would understand the consequences of threatening what mattered most to me. The community center was unusually full for a monthly HOA meeting. Word had spread about several contentious issues on the agenda, including a proposed 20% increase in monthly dues and new landscaping requirements. The tension in the room was palpable. I took a seat in the back row, nodding to Bob, who sat across the aisle. Grace arrived a few minutes later and slid into the seat beside me, her leather portfolio in hand. She always came prepared, a habit from her years as an attorney. I had told her about the notice, and she had offered to look into the legality of it after the meeting. At the front of the room, Anna Sinclair sat at the center of the board table, her posture perfect and her silver blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore a crisp white blouse with an expensive-looking blue blazer, a large diamond tennis bracelet catching the light whenever she moved her hand. To her right sat Douglas Hayes, the vice president, a man whose real estate business apparently benefited greatly from his association with Anna and her husband, Thomas, a prominent. Methodically worked through the agenda items, noting how she skillfully steered the conversation to support her positions. When someone raised an objection to the increased dues, she quickly cited property values and community prestige as justifications, barely allowing time for discussion before moving to a vote. The board members, with the exception of Linda Harrison, the meticulous secretary who occasionally frowned at procedural irregularities, seemed to follow Anna's lead without question. Finally, after nearly 2 hours of discussion about landscaping requirements and a heated debate about approved exterior paint colors, Anna opened the floor for other business. I raised my hand immediately. Anna's eyes narrowed slightly when she saw me, but she acknowledged me with a nod. I stood, feeling the eyes of my neighbors on me as I spoke. I received a notice about my boat being in violation of aesthetic standards, I began, keeping my voice even. I've reviewed our community guidelines and can't find any specific standards related to boats. Could you please clarify what rules my vessel is violating? The room grew quiet. Several of my neighbors turned to look at Anna with interest, perhaps wondering if they too might be in violation of rules they didn't know existed. Anna's smile didn't reach her eyes as she responded. Mr. Anderson, thank you for bringing this up. The board recently reviewed watercraft standards and found that several vessels, including yours, do not meet our community's aesthetic requirements. Your boat, in particular, is quite dated. The board feels it detracts from the upscale appearance we're trying to maintain for our lakefront properties. I remained standing, aware that my face was growing warm, but determined to keep my composure. Can you point to the specific guideline that defines dated as a violation? My boat is well maintained and structurally sound. There are boats in much worse condition that haven't received notices. That was when Douglas Hayes jumped in, his voice carrying an edge of condescension. The HOA has discretion to determine what constitutes an aesthetic violation. Your boat, frankly, looks like a relic from another era. We're trying to present Lakeside Estates as a modern luxury community. I pulled out my phone and pulled up several photos I had taken earlier that day. I'd like to show the board these pictures of other boats in the community that are in objectively worse condition than mine. If you're enforcing aesthetic standards, shouldn't they apply to everyone equally? Anna's jaw tightened visibly. Mr. Anderson, we're addressing violations on a case-by-case basis. Your situation is what's before us now. Bob Martinez stood up from his seat, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. I've lived here since this community was built, and I've never heard of aesthetic standards for boats. Linda, is there documentation of this rule? Linda Harrison shuffled through her papers, looking uncomfortable. I don't see anything specific about boat aesthetics in our current bylaws or in the minutes from previous meetings where this was officially adopted. Anna cut in smoothly. The board has inherent authority to address issues affecting property values. We don't need specific documentation for every decision. The meeting was deteriorating quickly. Other residents began to murmur among themselves, some looking confused, others concerned. As the discussion grew heated, Grace leaned over and whispered something that made my blood run cold. Jim, Anna's husband Thomas Sinclair, approached me last week asking if I thought you might be interested in selling your property. He mentioned something about developing waterfront lots for a higher-end clientele. Suddenly, the targeting of my boat made sense. It wasn't about the Wanderer at all. It was about forcing me out so Thomas Sinclair could get his hands on my property. Anna's voice cut through my thoughts. The board's decision stands. You have 30 days to remove the boat from your property or you'll face a fine of $100 per day. This matter is closed. She tapped her gavel with finality and moved on to the next item. I walked out of that meeting with my mind racing and a slow burn of anger building inside me. This wasn't just about arbitrary rules anymore. This was a calculated attempt to drive me out of my home. As I pulled into my driveway that evening, the lights from my house reflected on the lake's surface, creating a path of golden ripples that led to the silhouette of the Wanderer gently rocking at my dock. I went inside and poured myself a drink, trying to sort through my options. That's when I remembered the property surveys and documents from when I purchased the house. I dug through my home office until I found the drawer that contained all my property records. As I spread the documents across my desk, a detail on one of the older property maps caught my eye, something I hadn't paid attention to before. A small discrepancy in the property lines that Anna Sinclair probably never considered. The morning light streaming through my office window illuminated the property documents spread across my desk. I had been up half the night studying the surveys, deed records, and original development plans for Lakeside Estates. What I had discovered was astounding. According to the original survey and property description, my land extended farther along the shoreline than I had realized. The small neck of land that connected the neighborhood's main walking path to the community marina actually fell within my property boundaries. I double-checked the measurements and compared them with the current county records. There it was, in black and white. A surveying error made years ago had never been corrected. Legally, I owned not just my house and dock, but the only access to the marina that the HOA prized so highly. I called Grace immediately, hoping her expertise in real estate law could either confirm my discovery or let me know if I was missing something. She arrived an hour later, her expression shifting from skepticism to surprise as she reviewed the documents. "This is remarkable, Jim," she said finally, pushing her glasses up on her nose. "Based on these surveys and the legal description in your deed, you do own this section of land. The HOA has been using it all these years without a formal easement agreement." She flipped through more pages, her brow furrowed in concentration. "There's no record that the previous owner ever granted permission for this use, at least not in writing. Legally speaking, the HOA has been trespassing on your property." I leaned back in my chair, processing this information. "So I could actually prevent access to the marina if I wanted to?" Grace nodded slowly. "Technically, yes, but that would be a nuclear option, Jim. It would affect everyone in the community, not just Anna." I understood her concern, but part of me couldn't help but see this as the perfect leverage. What if I pursued this legally, not to shut down access permanently, but to establish my rights? Grace considered this for a moment. "We could file for a declaratory judgment to formally establish your ownership. Once that's done, you could negotiate an easement agreement with the HOA on your terms." As we discussed the possibilities, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was a photo from Bob, showing a second notice that had been left at my door. This one with more threatening language about enforcement actions if I didn't comply with the boat removal order. The notice mentioned potential liens against my property, daily compounding fines, and even the possibility of the HOA hiring contractors to remediate the violation at my expense. "This is harassment, plain and simple," Grace said, her professional demeanor momentarily slipping to reveal genuine indignation. "They're counting on you not knowing your rights or being too intimidated to fight back." That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. Bob Martinez knocked on my door, his weathered face looking troubled. "Got a minute, Jim?" he asked. We sat on my back deck, overlooking the lake, the Wanderer visible at the dock below. Bob didn't waste time with small talk. "I was on the board for 15 years before I stepped down last year. What Anna is doing isn't new. She and her husband have been systematically targeting homeowners they want out." Bob explained that over the past few years, several residents had sold their homes after facing similar harassment from the HOA. In each case, the buyers were either friends of the Sinclairs. Sinclairs are business associates of Thomasy. They're trying to take control of as many lakefront properties as possible. I've kept my mouth shut because I didn't have proof, but what they're doing to you is the same playbook. I shared my discovery about the property line with Bob, whose eyes widened in surprise. That would explain why they've been so keen on controlling that strip of land. They've spent HOA funds to maintain it specifically, even though other common areas get neglected. Before he left, Bob mentioned that Anna was planning a major marina event in 2 weeks, a fundraiser with local business leaders and politicians that she hoped would boost her husband's connections for an upcoming judicial appointment. "It's her big chance to show off," Bob said with a knowing look. "Would be a shame if something interfered with those plans." After Bob left, I made a decision. I called a surveying company to get an official verification of my property boundaries. If Anna wanted to play hardball, she was about to discover she had chosen the wrong opponent. 3 days later, I had official confirmation. The surveyor, a meticulous woman named Eleanor, who had been measuring property lines in the county for over 20 years, confirmed exactly what I had suspected. I owned 0.7 acres of lakefront property, including the narrow access path to the marina. The discrepancy had originated in 1997, when a surveying error during the development's second phase had incorrectly assigned that strip of land to common areas rather than to my lot. Armed with this information, I consulted with Grace's colleague, a property rights attorney named Michael Fitzgerald, who specialized in exactly these kinds of disputes. "This is quite straightforward from a legal perspective, Mr. Anderson. You have several options," he explained. "You could seek an injunction against the HOA for trespassing, you could negotiate a formal easement agreement, or you could simply assert your property rights by marking and restricting access to your land, which would force them to approach you for a solution." Michael cautioned that legal proceedings could be lengthy and expensive, but simply asserting my rights by marking my property would be perfectly legal. "Just make sure you document everything and notify the HOA formally of your intentions," he advised. With that guidance in mind, I developed my plan. I would mark my property boundaries and construct a fence, not immediately to block access, but to establish my legal ownership in a way that couldn't be ignored. I contacted a fencing company and scheduled installation for the day before Anna's big marina event. The timing wasn't coincidental. If Anna wanted to use threats and intimidation to force me out of my home, she was about to learn that I had resources of my own. Over the next week, I quietly prepared. I ordered private property and no trespassing signs, arranged for the fencing materials to be delivered discreetly to my garage, and installed security cameras at strategic points around my property. I also drafted a formal letter to the HOA informing them of my property rights and my intention to secure my land. I held off on sending it, planning to deliver it in person when the time was right. Meanwhile, Anna sent a third notice about my boat, this one threatening legal action if I didn't comply immediately. I filed it away with the others, evidence of harassment that might prove useful later. As the day of action approached, I found myself strangely calm. This wasn't about revenge. It was about standing up to a bully who had targeted me and others before me. It was about protecting what was mine, my home, my father's boat, and now, as I had discovered, a piece of land that gave me unexpected leverage. The night before the fence installation, I could hardly sleep, not from anxiety, but from anticipation. In just a few hours, Anna Sinclair would learn that her actions had consequences. The morning of the fence installation dawned clear and bright, a perfect Oregon summer day. At precisely 5 a.m., a team of workers from Cascade Fencing arrived at my property. I had specifically hired a company from the next county over to avoid any conflicts of interest with local contractors who might have connections to the HOA board. After introductions and a quick briefing, I walked the property line one last time with Rick, the foreman, confirming the markers placed by the surveyor. The workers began driving cedar posts into the ground at 6-foot intervals, following the boundary precisely, including the critical section that cut directly across the well-worn path to the marina, the only practical land access to the community's prized amenity. By 7:30, with the morning sun now fully illuminating the lake and the fence taking obvious shape, neighbors began to notice the activity. Some stopped on their morning walks, curiosity evident on their faces as they watched the workers efficiently installing the attractive cedar fencing. I offered polite explanations to those who asked, showing them the survey documents when necessary. At 8:15, Anna Sinclair's silver Mercedes screeched to a halt in front of my house. She stormed up my driveway, her face flushed with anger. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, gesturing wildly at the workers installing fence posts. I maintained a calm demeanor as I responded. "Good morning, Anna. I'm securing my property boundaries based on the official survey. Would you like to see the documentation?" I held out the surveyor's report, which she ignored. "You can't put up a fence here. This is a community access point to the marina," she said, her voice rising. "Actually," I replied, "this is my private property, as confirmed by the county records and this recent survey. The HOA has been using it without permission or a legal easement." Anna's face paled slightly as the implications set in. "This is ridiculous. You're just doing this because of the boat notice." I shook my head. "This isn't about the boat, Anna. This is about property rights. When I discovered that I owned this land, I decided it was time to properly mark and secure it. As a homeowner, that's my right." Anna pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the police. This is vandalism of community property." I smiled slightly. "Please do. I've already spoken with them about my plans to secure my private property. They're aware of the situation." Sure enough, when a police cruiser arrived 30 minutes later in response to Anna's call, the officer reviewed my documentation and confirmed that I had every right to fence my property. "This appears to be a civil matter between homeowners and the HOA. Mr. Anderson is within his rights to secure his property boundaries." By noon, word had spread throughout the neighborhood. Residents gathered at a respectable distance, watching the drama unfold. Bob arrived with 2 cups of coffee, handing one to me as he settled into a lawn chair he'd brought along. "Quite a show you're putting on," he said with a wink. Anna spent most of the morning on her phone, presumably calling board members and trying to find a legal loophole. Douglas Hayes arrived around 1 p.m., his face ashen when he saw how far the fence installation had progressed. He huddled with Anna on the sidewalk, their urgent whispers occasionally rising to audible levels as they argued about what to do. I overheard phrases like "the fundraiser" and "career ending" and "find another way in." As the afternoon wore on, the reality of the situation became clear to everyone. The fence would completely block the only practical access to the marina. While residents with lakefront property could still reach it by boat, the vast majority of community members, and importantly, all of Anna's VIP guests for tomorrow's event, would have no way to get there. Around 3 p.m., Anna approached me again, her earlier fury replaced by a strained attempt at diplomacy. "Jim, let's discuss this reasonably. Whatever issues you have with the HOA notices, we can work something out. But this fence cannot be completed today. We have an important community event tomorrow evening." I feigned surprise. "An event? I wasn't aware. I don't believe I received an invitation." Anna's forced smile tightened. "It's a fundraiser for the community. Very important people will be attending. Surely you don't want to be responsible for ruining a charitable event?" I considered her words for a moment. "That does sound important. Perhaps we should discuss the terms under which I might consider granting the HOA an easement agreement." "Cross my property." Anna's relief was palpable, but short-lived as I continued. Of course, any such agreement would need to acknowledge my property rights and address certain concerns I have about how the HOA has been operating. By 5 o'clock, the fence was complete. 6 feet tall, with a locked gate directly across the path to the marina. I had the only key. As the workers packed up their equipment, I could see Anna on her phone, in her car, gesturing frantically as she spoke. The first guests for her event would be arriving in less than 24 hours, and currently they had nowhere to go. That evening, a delegation arrived at my door. Anna stood at the front, flanked by Douglas, Linda, and several other HOA board members. Behind them, I recognized State Representative William Parker and his wife, along with several prominent business owners from the area. Anna's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide her distress as she asked if we could discuss the situation in private. I invited everyone into my living room, which quickly became crowded with uncomfortable HOA board members and confused VIP guests. Jim has recently discovered a property line discrepancy, Anna began, attempting to frame the situation in her favor. "We're hoping to reach a temporary accommodation for tomorrow's fundraiser while we sort out the details." I decided it was time to lay all the cards on the table. "Let me clarify the situation for everyone," I said, passing out copies of the property survey and the 3 threatening notices I had received about my boat. 3 weeks ago, I received a notice ordering me to remove my late father's sailboat from my dock, citing aesthetic violations. When I questioned this at the HOA meeting, I discovered there was no such rule in our bylaws. After receiving 2 more increasingly threatening notices, I reviewed my property documents and made a surprising discovery. I explained how the land providing access to the marina legally belonged to me and had for years without any formal easement agreement with the HOA. What's particularly interesting, I continued, is that shortly after receiving these notices, I learned that Anna's husband, Thomas, had been inquiring about whether I might sell my property. The room grew uncomfortably silent. Representative Parker looked at Anna with raised eyebrows. Linda, the HOA secretary, cleared her throat nervously. I should mention that I've never found any documentation of aesthetic standards for boats in our records. It's not in our bylaws or any approved amendments. Douglas shifted in his seat, his discomfort evident. Anna attempted to regain control of the narrative. "This is all a misunderstanding. The board has discretion to enforce community standards, and we've received complaints about Jim's boat." I raised an eyebrow. "Complaints from whom, exactly?" I spoke with my nearby neighbors, and none of them had issues with my well-maintained sailboat. In fact, they pointed out several vessels in worse condition that hadn't received notices. Douglas, perhaps sensing which way the wind was blowing, made a surprising admission. "The boat rule was informal. We were trying to update the community image." Representative Parker, who had been listening intently, finally spoke up. "It sounds to me like there are 2 separate issues here. A property boundary matter that needs legal resolution, and questions about all homeowners that should concern all homeowners." He turned to me. "Mr. Anderson, regardless of how this situation developed, would you consider allowing access for tomorrow's charity event? It's for the Children's Hospital, after all." I had no desire to punish a worthy charity for Anna's actions. I'd be willing to open the gate temporarily, but I'd need certain assurances in writing from the HOA board first. Over the next hour, with Representative Parker mediating, we hammered out an agreement. The HOA would formally acknowledge my property rights and agree to negotiate a proper easement agreement within 30 days. All notices regarding my boat would be rescinded, and a special board meeting would be called to review HOA governance procedures. Anna sat silently through most of the negotiation, her earlier confidence replaced by barely contained fury. By the time everyone left, I had a signed document from the HOA board and a key ceremony planned for the following afternoon where I would symbolically unlock the gate for the charity event. As I closed the door behind the last guest, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "We should talk. I have information about the Sinclairs you need to hear." Martin Sinclair, Anna's ex-husband. The next morning, I met Martin Sinclair at a coffee shop in town, away from curious neighbors. He was a surprisingly ordinary-looking man in his mid-50s, with thinning hair and tired eyes that suggested years of dealing with Anna had taken their toll. "I've been watching what's happening in Lakeside Estates," he began, after we'd settled with our coffees. "When I heard about the fence situation, I knew it was time to share what I know." Martin explained that before their divorce 5 years ago, Anna and Thomas had discussed plans to gradually gain control of the lakefront properties in Lakeside Estates. They want to convert the community from single-family homes to an upscale resort development. Thomas has investors lined up through his law office connections. According to Martin, the plan was to use the HOA as a tool to pressure certain homeowners, particularly those with prime waterfront lots, to sell. They target people they think won't fight back, retirees, recent divorcees, people going through financial difficulties. They use selective rule enforcement, create new regulations, and generally make life difficult until selling seems like the easiest option. Martin pulled out his tablet and showed me records he'd kept from his time living with Anna. Notes about which properties they wanted to acquire, tactics to use, and even a rough timeline for the development plan. After you put up that fence, Thomas called me in a panic, trying to find out if I still had any legal claim to Anna's house that could complicate their plans. That's when I decided to contact you. I spent the rest of the morning verifying Martin's claims. A search for county property records confirmed that a company called Sinclair Lakefront Holdings, LLC, registered to Thomas' law office address, had indeed purchased 6 lakefront properties in the past 3 years. Grace helped me trace the ownership structure, which revealed connections to a development company specializing in luxury vacation rentals. When I showed her Martin's information, she let out a low whistle. This explains a lot. They're not just being petty HOA tyrants, they're executing a business plan at the expense of their neighbors. By early afternoon, I had enough evidence to make a compelling case. I called Bob and asked him to help spread the word about an emergency community meeting at my house immediately following Anna's charity event. Tell people it's about the future of Lakeside Estates. They'll want to hear this. At 4 o'clock, as promised, I unlocked the gate to allow access to the marina for the charity fundraiser. Anna avoided making eye contact with me during the brief ceremony where Representative Parker made a gracious speech about community cooperation and working through differences. The event proceeded as planned, with caterers, musicians, and guests in formal attire filing past my new fence to the marina beyond. I attended briefly, making polite conversation while observing Anna and Thomas working the crowd, seemingly unaware that their carefully constructed plans were about to unravel. As the charity event wound down, residents began making their way to my house for the community meeting I had announced. I had set up chairs in my backyard overlooking the lake, and by 7:30, nearly 50 homeowners had gathered, curious about what I had to share. Bob had helped me prepare a simple presentation with the evidence we had gathered. When everyone was seated, I began by explaining how my investigation into the boat notice had led to a much larger discovery. This isn't just about my property rights or an arbitrary rule about boats, I told my neighbors. This is about a systematic plan to change the nature of our community without our knowledge or consent. I presented the evidence step by step. The pattern of targeted harassment, the properties already acquired by the Sinclair's company, the development plans Martin had revealed, and the financial records showing HOA funds being diverted for marina improvements that aligned with their resort plan. With the resort development concept, the projection screen behind me displayed documents, property transactions, and a timeline that made the scheme undeniable. With each new revelation, gasps and murmurs rippled through the audience. As I spoke, I could see the shock and anger spreading through the crowd like a wave. Longtime residents looked particularly betrayed when they realized how they had been manipulated. Near the back of the gathering, I noticed Anna and Thomas arriving, their faces darkening as they realized what was happening. Thomas attempted to interrupt, calling out that this was slander and misrepresentation, but several residents shushed him with surprising force. "Let him finish," called out Eleanor Jenkins, a 70-year-old retired school teacher who had lived at Lakeside Estate since its founding. "I've been wondering why I suddenly got cited for my bird feeders after 15 years without a single complaint." Her normally gentle voice carried an edge of anger I'd never heard before. When I finished presenting the evidence, the room fell into a stunned silence. It was broken when Linda, the HOA secretary, stood up with her ever-present notebook in hand. "I can confirm that funds were redirected without proper board approval," she said, her voice slightly trembling, but growing stronger as she continued. I've documented several instances where Anna made decisions without consulting the full board. Last month alone, $22,000 was transferred from our reserve fund to what was labeled as Marina Enhancement Planning, but I was never shown any official proposals or bids for such work. She adjusted her glasses and flipped through her meticulous notes. When I questioned it, it was told it was routine maintenance allocation and not to worry about the details. Douglas Hayes, perhaps sensing which way the wind was blowing, stood up next. His usual confidence had evaporated, replaced with a nervous energy as he made a surprising confession. Thomas approached me last year about helping them acquire specific properties, he admitted, avoiding eye contact with the Sinclairs. He promised me exclusive listings on the resort units once they were developed. I didn't think it would affect so many people. He said it would just be a few properties, that it would improve values for everyone. His voice trailed off as several neighbors glared at him. The floodgates opened. One by one, neighbors stood to share their experiences. Frank and Maria Gonzalez detailed how they'd been hounded about their vegetable garden until they nearly sold their retirement home. Widower Henry Thompson described receiving weekly notices about his vintage truck that had never been an issue during the previous decade. Rebecca Wilson, a single mother who worked night shifts as a nurse, tearfully explained how she'd been fined for leaving her trash cans out too long when her shift schedule changed. I paid over $3,000 in fines last year for violations that were never issues before, said George Fleming, a retired accountant who had meticulously documented every interaction. And look at this. He held up a printout of property records. My next-door neighbor sold to Sinclair Holdings 4 months after moving out, and they paid 15% below market value. These people were breaking under the pressure of constant harassment. The picture that emerged was damning and far more extensive than even I had suspected. The Sinclairs had been systematically using the HOA as a personal tool to advance their business interests at the expense of the community, creating an atmosphere of stress and fear that had affected dozens of families. As more stories poured out, I noticed several residents comforting each other, many hearing for the first time that they weren't alone in their experiences. When all the evidence had been presented, Bob stood up and addressed the group. I move that we call for an immediate vote of no confidence in the current HOA leadership and elect an interim board until proper elections can be held. The motion was seconded immediately, and a vote was taken on the spot. The result was overwhelming, 52 in favor, 3 opposed. Anna, her face a mask of fury and humiliation, attempted one last defense. "You can't do this. This meeting isn't official. There are procedures." Bob cut her off firmly. "The bylaws allow for emergency procedures in cases of gross misconduct. I think we've established that standard today." The community elected an interim board on the spot, with Bob as temporary president, Grace as vice president, and 3 other respected residents filling out the remaining positions. Their first official act was to rescind all pending violation notices issued under Anna's leadership and to initiate an audit of the HOA's finances. Their second act was to begin negotiation of a formal easement agreement with me for access to the marina, one that would protect both my property rights and the community's interests. As the meeting dispersed, neighbors stopped to thank me for bringing the truth to light. Anna and Thomas left without speaking to anyone, their grand plans for a lakefront resort empire crumbling around them. In the weeks that followed, our community underwent a significant transformation. The interim board, under Bob's leadership, revised the HOA bylaws to prevent future abuses of power, requiring transparent decision-making and homeowner approval for major changes. My property boundary was formally acknowledged, and I granted an easement to the HOA for access to the marina, in exchange for a nominal annual fee and permanent protection for the wanderer at my dock. An independent audit revealed that Anna had diverted nearly $50,000 of HOA funds for purposes related to the development plan. Legal action was initiated to recover those funds, and both Anna and Thomas faced professional ethics investigations. His from the State Bar Association, hers from the Real Estate Licensing Board. The Sinclairs put their house on the market less than a month after the community meeting and moved away shortly thereafter. Their development company dissolved, and the properties they had acquired were sold to families who wanted to be part of our rejuvenated community. Bob resigned from the board, and his real estate business suffered as neighbors chose other agents for their transactions. In a twist that seemed like poetic justice, Martin Sinclair, Anna's ex-husband, who had provided the crucial evidence, purchased Anna's former home at a significant discount and became an active, positive member of the community. As for me, I spent that summer restoring the Wanderer to better-than-new condition. I replaced the worn upholstery, refinished the woodwork, and installed new sails. On warm weekends, I began taking neighborhood kids out for sailing lessons, teaching them the same skills my father had taught me years earlier. The fence along my property line remained as a reminder, but I installed a beautiful wooden gate that stayed open, secured with a decorative anchor rather than a lock. The marina became the true community gathering place it was meant to be, hosting cookouts, sailing regattas, and even small concerts on the dock. A year after the fence incident, as it came to be known in neighborhood lore, Lakeside Estates had transformed into the kind of community I had always hoped for when I purchased my home. The new HOA board, elected in a record turnout vote, focused on enhancing our shared spaces rather than policing residents' choices. Property values increased naturally as word spread about our lakeside community with a positive atmosphere and reasonable governance. Bob often joked that I should run for HOA president, given my proven leadership skills, but I was content with my role as the community sailing instructor and occasional host of sunset gatherings on my dock. Sometimes as I sit on the Wanderer, watching the sun sink below the tree line, casting golden light across Green Lake's surface, I think about how differently things might have turned out. Had I simply given in to Anna's demands and removed my father's boat, the Sinclairs might eventually have succeeded in their plan to transform our neighborhood into a commercial resort. Instead, my stubborn refusal to part with a family heirloom led to the preservation of an entire community. Sometimes an old boat isn't just a vessel for traveling across water. Sometimes, as in my case, it becomes the vehicle for delivering justice and teaching arrogant people a lesson they'll never forget. The Wanderer remains where it belongs, at my dock, ready for the next adventure. A symbol of standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem stacked against you. If there's one lesson I've learned from this experience, it's that knowing your rights and being willing to defend them, calmly but firmly, can make all the difference. Bullies like Anna Sinclair count on people giving in rather than fighting back. They use intimidation, selective enforcement, and the appearance of authority to get their way. But when someone stands up to them, armed with facts, documentation, and determination, their power quickly crumbles. My father taught me that on the water and in life, it's not the size of the boat that matters, but the skill and courage of the person at the helm. I'd like to think he'd be proud of how I navigated these troubled waters, not just preserving his beloved Wanderer, but creating a wake of positive change that rippled throughout our entire community.